session, I hope turns into a conversation that we get to watch. So, assuming all of you have been here, a brief reminder of who we've been able to have on campus today. From the far end, Dr. Lamar Reich, now our distinguished professor of business management, extinguished, and former colleague at Georgetown with a distinguished career there in the School of Business. Crystal Silva McCormick, LCU alum, doctoral candidate at Lutheran School of Theology in Muslim-Christian relations, minister in Austin. Crystal is also a board member now of the World Parliament of Religions, and brings that to the table. Chris Dowdy, a graduate of SMU and ACU before that. Chris received his doctorate from SMU, and what's the specialty? Religion and race and
Christian ethics is my discipline.
Christian ethics.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. All right. Rachel Steiner-Vlachos on this end, PhD candidate at Rice, working in race relations and religion in South Africa and United States, and our distinguished guest, Dr. Villavicencio, whom you just heard. I thought it would be nice to have the four of you around Dr. Villavicencio to make a response, a short response to his comments. I'll stop you if you take too much time. We will be going here until noon.
Should I start? Okay, I guess I get the honor of beginning. I very much appreciated your candor and honesty about the difficulty and the partial and provisional nature of truth and reconciliation commissions, particularly in South Africa, but also with providing us the contrast with the alternative. And often I find that we have to act without knowing the outcome, without guarantees. I think that's a lesson that a lot of people learned in South Africa during the transition years, because the alternative is unspeakable or unimaginable. I was really thinking about South Africa now, 20 years later, because that's where my work is now, in post-apartheid South Africa or democratic South Africa. I was thinking about the role that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission played in giving people the ability to speak the unspeakable, and how important that is, and just the need for that ongoing work of people being able to bring voice as some measure of repair. But also this question of subjective truth, which you spoke about, which is so powerful, or was so powerful for victims. Now I found, like you said, when I talk with young Black South Africans, they often say that things are no better now, or maybe even worse than under apartheid, because they're feeling such futility, or isolation is probably the better word, isolation, those that don't have access to the world of progress that has impacted some Black South Africans since 1994. And their subjective truth is this sense of things haven't improved, and now they even look nostalgically back at the apartheid system, and I'm not sure how we wrestle with that nostalgia for the kind of order that oppression also created, and the sense of identity that it offered to them to feel a sense of struggle against something. And with that, I guess along with that subjective truth, I was really disturbed most recently to hear people talking about this same group of people in Soweto who I was talking with, to talk about the Constitution now as something that is white in their memory, in their sort of subjective experience. They don't see the Constitution of South Africa as providing any sort of meaningful sense of change to their lives, and they don't see it as a product of hard-won negotiation or political courage with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and all the political actors that were involved in discussing what are our new values as a society. Instead, they see it as something white. and that in some way that those values that are enshrined in the Constitution are not speaking to their everyday realities. So I wondered if you might comment a little bit about how we deal with those challenges now.
Do I do that? Okay, and is this on? I shall be very brief. And Rachel, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people who say not sufficient has changed. Many say it was even better then than it is now. Well, it's a little bit of nostalgia and all those sorts of things. You know, I always think of dear old Moses in the leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. And when they were wandering around there for 40 years, you know, some of them said, my goodness, you know, we'd rather go back. You're not delivering, old man. And yeah, so I think that's natural. I do think that South Africa has made progress. There's no question about it. People have rights that they never had. People have the vote. I wish they'd use the vote, because they grumble and grouse about this government who doesn't do this and should have done that. But you know what? They'll vote for them again, because that's the party that gave us liberation. And after all, Father Mandela, Papa, he's the one who has led us, and we'll vote for him. Well, this is kind of sad. They're critical very often of the Constitution. I'm particularly proud of the fact that the African National Congress, which is the dominant party in South Africa, has made no attempt to change the Constitution with those clauses. I mean, that's good news. That's maturity. How many times did you want to change your Constitution? But you know, we haven't changed it. And in that Constitution, there are a number of socioeconomic clauses, which are very high-sounding, almost romantic, which haven't been implemented. And we've had several court cases in relation to that, where the Constitutional Court, equivalent of your Supreme Court, have ruled that those clauses can only be implemented within the capacity of those who want to make the change. But as a result of those clauses, people have got access to hospital, they've got access to housing, etc. So we're doing okay. But we feel a little bit like Moses sometimes. And we want to say to these people, hey, you know, this country was built over 350 years of colonialism and 50 years of white rule and all the rest of it. We've only been around for 21 years. So we get in there, but we've got a lot of long way to go. So I'm glad when people say there's no change, but I do tell them they're wrong.
Thank you both, and thank you, Charles, for the talk this morning. Just the richness of your analysis of that experience, I think it's just a real gift to all of us to be able to be in the presence of somebody who was president of the creation, you know, at this very particular moment in history. And I'm really glad the students that are here have had a chance to hear that. I would have been very glad for that opportunity myself at the tender young age of 19 or whatever, many years ago. But the things that really hit me as you were talking, one is your, I think, a very nuanced take on what forgiveness is and can be in the political system, and as we were talking just a moment ago, you know, pushing the sort of high-flying language of forgiveness out of the actual sort of rough and tumble of that political engagement, and focusing more on reconciling or being able to just sort of get along, right? What's the process that gets us to that point? And I hope that we take that to heart, those of us in the room who are trying to figure out how to put the values and the practices and the gifts of the Christian heritage in conversation with meaningful political discourse, and trying to figure out how to be fully human as Christians. and to be committed to the cause of justice at a number of levels. And I think that, you know, when we get excited about using the tools of Christianity in public, that's good. You know, I think we should encourage that. We also ought to hear these words of caution about what rushing too quickly towards a sort of anodyne or non-realistic vision of forgiveness can do, which is to confuse the good feelings of perpetrators who said they're sorry with the actual healing of victims, which is a much longer and complicated process. And I think we ought to take that to heart in the United States at a number of levels, attending to the ways that people who are historically dispossessed process our public life together. And all of our language about letting bygones be bygones, let the past be the past, or trying to measure the number of years it's been since the Emancipation Proclamation, whatever it is, however it is we analyze that stuff or put that stuff out there, I think we do well to listen to the experiences of those in South Africa who have seen this process up close and used all the language and all the tools and found ways to navigate that have been more or less successful. And I think we benefit greatly from that. And the other thing I wanted to point out too is how, and that I'm grateful for and I'd love for you to comment on, especially just as somebody who's seen the United States from who's done education here and obviously has great relationships with people from the United States, but as somebody who sees it from an ocean away, as we process the political process here, as we think about that and talk about that in our various contexts, just the significance of leadership in those spaces, of the significance of political leadership and what it means to, I think, to negotiate with people who you maybe have reasons to despise, which if we listen to our public rhetoric now, like, we have lots of language about who we should despise, right? But we have very little, I think, energy put into figuring out how to actually make things happen together that are meaningful, especially for people who are dispossessed. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that. You mentioned a little bit about it yesterday, but especially for those of us who, let's be real, right? Especially those of us in Texas, right? The rhetoric we hear from a lot of our political leaders in this particular state is not positive about the role of government, and is, we run for office based on how much we despise the office. So there's a contradiction there, and I think it's worth thinking about how politics is not a clean and holy thing, as ways experienced in South Africa, but it did meaningful things for people. So I'd just like to hear your perspective on some of those things.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And, I think you've made a comment and my response is a comment. I think we're basically trying to say the same thing. I think we've got to say politics is not religion. And you, in your country, have that clear distinction between church and state. Politics is not religion. Politics is the place where we come together and try to get some consensus on the next step forward. Politics doesn't create the ultimate solution. It's the next step forward. It's full of compromise. It's full of trying this, trying that, let's move on. And I think if I get disappointed about anything in your political debate, it is precisely what you have just said. That we criticize the other, we condemn, but where's the solution? How are we going to work together? And certainly my experience in the TRC was that major challenge, where I had to bracket theological explanations, and I had to try and take those values and articulate them in secular language. I remember a guy interviewing me, all of us were sort of minor celebrities in those days, and this journalist came and interviewed me, and he said, listen, I know you're a theologian. Has that equipped you for your work in this commission? I said, I've hardly used a theological word or ethical symbol in my 3 years in this place. And yet this is the most theological job I've ever done in my life. Getting some dirt under my fingernails, needing to strike a deal, trying damn hard to understand what some crazy perpetrator is trying to say to me. That's the real world in which we live. And that's where we got to go. And I think this is what I hear you saying. Just my last comment. You know, I think if anybody, any theologian, has made a lasting impact upon my life, it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis pretty close to the end of the war, one of those tragic things. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his Letters and Papers from Prison, says this. He says, if we as Christians cannot articulate our message in a secular way, in a way that the world can understand, then maybe we failed completely. And that, I think, is the challenge of ethics. Certainly it's the challenge of politics. Not asking anybody to throw away their convictions and their belief, but just understand the guy next door to you probably doesn't even know if you're talking about it, if you preach too much. So just let's find that common ground. But that's what you've been saying.
I think that two things that stood out to me from your talk today, thank you for that. Well, actually, first was a quote from Martin Luther King, which was when people, especially white pastors, were asking him to move on, and because laws had changed, and his response was, "The laws don't change people's hearts." And I think about that now, and I think about the story of South Africa and the story of the United States and where we are at now, and what it must feel like to be black in the United States, and to hear Martin Luther King's words that the laws don't change hearts, and that resonates still today. Because regardless of what laws we have in place, we've never had what you had, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the second thing, piggyback on what I'm saying about this, is the power of story, which you brought so well, the power to tell stories, and what happens in the United States when black people try to tell their stories. Even in 2015, the story that goes way back, and the stories about what happens now, and the power of story can be healing. But what happens when people try to tell their stories in the United States is an attempt to silence. And so we so need healing in the United States when it comes to race, but there is no space for people to tell those stories because people don't want to hear the stories. And how healing that could be as a step towards the road to forgiveness. Because I think what Chris was saying is that forgiveness is a process. Sometimes in Christianity we imagine that it's snap our fingers and that's what Jesus wants, but it's a process. And I think the last thing is just to be mindful of the power of story in Scripture, in that every time Jesus had an encounter, the Scripture tells us the story of that person. And my assumption then is that Jesus took the time to know that person's story, and so that to be faithful followers of Jesus is that we be willing to hear the story that can offer, at the very least, some healing, as it did through this commission.
I thought he wanted to respond.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I agree with everything you say, ma'am. Yeah, no, thank you. I just pick up on your comment on Martin Luther King, who was, of course, a great inspiration for me as well, and your analysis of law can't do it. I also remember Martin Luther King saying in a situation that the law can't force you to love me, but it sure can prevent you from lynching me. So we need laws as well in order to survive, but never only that. I've just this week, as I said earlier, taught a seminar on Nuremberg and Tokyo. And some of my students get very animated, this is what we got to do, and hunt down the Nazis and all the rest of it. I said, do remember that when the Israelis put Eichmann on trial, they turned to Hannah Arendt, the great German philosopher, and asked her, do you think Eichmann should have been hanged? She shrugged her shoulders and she said, my question to you is, what more are you going to do? You want to hang him, hang him. But what more are you going to do? And I think that's the question that we face. What more are we going to do? And I loved your sermon this morning. I told you that if I told Christelle if she preached down the road from me, I'd be in church every Sunday.
Charles, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'll explain to the group the questions a bit. The questions are, I'm going to ask you to explain two people, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. It's my view, and I think Charles shares it, that the achievement in South Africa is not due to just a small number of people, but to a large number of people of all skin colors and a variety of religious and non-religious backgrounds. It's very much a national achievement. However, within that, there were some individuals who appear to have been particularly important. And at least from where I sit, it is fascinating to ask how someone like Nelson Mandela comes to be who he is, and how Desmond Tutu comes to be who he is. And I don't know many people who've known both of those. You're one of them. In fact, you're the only one, Charles. Help me understand those two men.
Wow. One's friends have a way of putting one on the spot. Lamar, where do I begin? In 1990, 91, I wrote a book. Academics always write books, that's what they do. Fish swim, academics write books. But it was based on 20 or 30 interviews which I did with famous people. People were returning from exile, people being released from prison. And I did interviews with these people. And I said to them, I want to talk to you about two things. One is religion, the other one's politics. And University of California Press published the book, The Spirit of Hope. When I met Mr. Mandela, Madiba, as we called him, which is his clan name, I got to this point on religion. And I said, now, sir, you were educated in Methodist mission schools, and you've commented on prison chaplains who visited you. Would you, sir, talk to me just a little bit about your religion? He said, no, I don't talk about religion. It's too deep, it's too personal. I said, you don't want to talk about that? He said, no, I don't talk about religion, I talk about other things. Which I found amazing. Because in his own way, he's a deeply, deeply spiritual man. He's holy. He's the nearest thing to God that we have in South Africa. But he would not see himself as a specifically religious person, but showed great respect for pastors who came to visit him. There's a kramat. What is a kramat? It's a shrine, a Muslim shrine. And we have 5 kramats in South Africa, which are shrines. And there's one on Robben Island, because one of the early Muslims who came to this country, to South Africa, was actually buried there. And he asked for permission when he was in prison to go and visit that kramat, and he did it. He's a deeply spiritual man. Tutu is an overtly spiritual man. As I said earlier, if you want Desmond Tutu, you're going to get Archbishop Desmond Tutu. But the amazing thing, Lamar, for me, is that we in South Africa were blessed to have two great men at the same time. You know, now you look back into your history and you have those iconic figures, and you can name them better than me, but certainly Abraham Lincoln, the world looks to him. George Washington, they don't come around every day. We had two at the same time. And I often think that we could have been in such a better place today if those two men were allowed to shape our future a lot earlier. Desmond Tutu was despised in South Africa. Despised, hated, rejected. Nelson Mandela was in prison. But two men with remarkable leadership capacity. And if anybody persuades me that there's difference between managing and leading, those two men have done that for me. I didn't work obviously as closely with Mr. Mandela as what I did with the Archbishop Tutu. But you know, Archbishop Tutu was one of those inspirational people. And I remember when those difficult days were there and we were trying to close on this final report, and I had to get it to the printer so we could give it to Mr. Mandela, and you know, and people were arguing and saying yes, but, and all the rest of it. The Archbishop will say, well, now it's lunchtime, so we're going to go and have lunch, and I'll come back at 3 o'clock because I'm going to have a nap. And he would come back at 3 o'clock and say, thank you for all of this, and you've done a splendid job. I'm very happy with it, but maybe you should do this, that, and the other thing, and look at this tonight. That's leadership. You know, if I said, excuse me, I'm going to have a nap, I'd have been fired. Both remarkable men, both fairly stubborn men, let me say that. Both men who have the capacity to go against the stream. And both men who have a tremendous capacity to love. And Lamar has heard me say this before, the things that Mr. Mandela did when he came out of prison. Percy Utah was the lead prosecutor of Nelson Mandela in his trial. Mr. Mandela invited him to come and have lunch with him in the presidency. Betsy Verwoerd, who was the widow of old Hendrik Verwoerd, who was the architect of apartheid. Nelson Mandela went to visit her. And there's a celebrated picture of him standing there with his arm around her. When he was inaugurated as prison, he invited two of his jailers, wardens in the prison, who looked after him on Robben Island, to come to the inauguration. This tremendous capacity to embrace the other. When we tried to get P.W. Botha to come to the commission, Tutu jumped in an aeroplane and went to go and visit him. Didn't succeed in getting him to come to the commission. But men who are stubborn, men who are driven, don't ever forget Mr. Mandela came from a chief's family. Royalty in that sense. He was born to be a leader. Tutu came from a very, very impoverished background, Klerksdorp in the old Transvaal, now Gauteng. But these two men just went through the ranks and emerged as leaders. Are leaders born, Lamar? But they can learn. And that's the thing that fascinates me about these two men is how on earth did these two men land in South Africa at the same time that they did? It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And Mr. Mandela is buried. Archbishop Tutu is a very, very ill man. It's coming. And what do we do then? We live off the memory, the spirit. I've just waffled. I haven't answered your question.
I'm frankly just interested in watching a conversation. Does anybody have a question here? Does anybody out here have a question you want to toss at the panel?
Let me ask you what I think will be an easier question. There's a story that I've been told, I suspect it was from Rolf Meyer, but I'm not certain, about a South African, active in the government, who describes how, as the struggle heats up, he chooses to remain in the government while some of his colleagues, offended by the government policies, resign in protest. But then, later, discovers that he, having made what is in some sense almost an embarrassing ethical choice, finds himself in a position of authority so that when it comes time to change things, he can do so or help do so. And it raises for me a whole set of thoughts about the ambiguity, the complexity of being responsible for important policies and the reality of human experience. Can I get you to reflect on that a bit?
Thank you for that, Lamar. I keep dragging you into the seminar that I'm teaching. In a couple of weeks' time, we deal with lustration, that process that was built into the political transition in Eastern Europe. And lustration was essentially a law that said that if you served in the old regime, you're not going to be able to serve in the new. And some of them even went so far as to say if you were a teacher in the old regime, you're not going to be able to teach now. And the basis of all of this, of course, if people are pedophiles, they shouldn't have access to students. They were saying if these people have these crazy, weird ideas of human ethics and ideology, you've got to just keep them out of the classroom, for heaven's sake. We'll put them aside. We didn't do that in South Africa. In fact, and I think I mentioned yesterday, Joe Slovo, the leader of the Communist Party, is the one who actually drove this. He said we've got to have a set of sunset clauses. And those sunset clauses will say that nobody who's in the civil service or anywhere else will be thrown out on day one of the new society. We'll keep them on. And many of them did stay on. And many of them did a phenomenal job. And Lamar, you refer to Rolf Meyer. He was a minister in the old government. He's making a huge contribution to the new government. So a lot of those civil servants, if you take them with you into the new society, they have much to contribute. And I think that's one of the things that we tried to do in South Africa, but we also have not always done it successfully. We have pushed people out who ought to be there running the electricity plant, Eskom, who ought to be there taking care of water. And some of those people felt so unwelcome that they packed up and left. So I think continuity is fundamentally important. And that's certainly something that Mr. Mandela understood. He appointed old white ministers to his new government. He used the Rolf Meyers of this world. And I've traveled in Africa. It's one of the things I do for fun, they say, and been to some pretty down market places. And I was in the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, on a certain day, and I met this young man. And I recognized immediately that he was an Afrikaner. And I started speaking to him in Afrikaans. He thought he was in heaven. And we had a long conversation. And we had a sandwich or something together at lunchtime. And I said, tell me about you. How did you get here? So he said, well, you know, he studied at Pretoria University, and then he got a job in foreign affairs, and he was always a back boy, and he was able to stay on. And eventually, they sent him to the DRC. Can I say it? A hellhole. And he basically built that embassy, the ambassador was telling me. He said he shipped in bricks and mortar in an aeroplane, in a Boeing aeroplane, that was stripped of its seats to bring stuff into the Congo. And he built this place. And I said, wow, Ambassador, somebody write a book about this guy. That's a magnificent story. Just this little Afrikaner boy who was prepared to buy cement and get some bricks and build an embassy. A huge contribution. We need more of those. You can't close down. You can't recreate the world overnight. You've got to take the past with you. And some of those people are objectionable, they're nasty, and we don't want them. But some of them roll their sleeves up and do a heck of a job. We tried to get that right, and we've backslidden a little bit. You know, we have a whole crop of young black students coming out of universities, many of them with fancy degrees, and they think they ought to get a job. And some of them are completely incompetent, but they are employed. So we're backsliding, but I think you carry it with you, and my friend, your friend, Rolf Meyer is one of those people who has come through it all and making an incredible contribution to the new society. And there are others, he's just one.
So I guess I absolutely agree, and I think that's the miracle of South Africa. And I think that Nelson Mandela was so wise, and just in terms of all the other leaders around him, to have the foresight to harness the energy and the skills. So, but the question is, so it seems to me that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about keeping the horizon of the future open for all South Africans and creating a South Africa where all who live in it can belong and have a sense and stake in the well-being of South Africa. But how do you also, it seems to me that in wanting to retain skills and retain leaders, you're also prioritizing in some way, or how do you deal with the idea of like whose future do you prioritize, and how do you bring people on, and how do you do capacity building, and how do you make sure there's a transfer of skills and opportunities? How do you I guess it's the question of leadership. How do you grow leaders and create the climate that allows new leaders to come up and be able to articulate their visions?
You know, it's a very, very difficult thing. Very difficult. And we're certainly experiencing that difficulty at the moment. The answer, I think, Rachel, is poetry rather than science. I wish there was a blueprint, but you've got to kind of balance this thing. And some of our brightest young kids who happen to be white are leaving the country because they don't feel they have the opportunity in government. You know, and I keep saying to them, listen, if you really want to stay here, just keep at it and you will find a job. And that's certainly my experience with a lot of young people. But we've got to encourage those bright young boys and girls who are white without shutting out the boys and girls who happen to be black. Now, how do you get that right? You know, we have this term in South Africa, we don't talk about multiracialism, we say non-racism. Race shouldn't come into it. But you know what? Race does come into it. You know, the other thing I want to say, and I'm going to shut up, is Mr. Mandela had the stature to demand things and to do things and to bring people in, just because who he was, just because he was Nelson Mandela. Jacob Zuma doesn't have that. So we all need another Mandela. Talking to some kids in in the Eastern Cape the other day, which is in a terrible, terrible state. And I said, so what do you do? He said, we're waiting for the next Mandela. Well, we can't wait for the next Mandela. We've just got to roll up our sleeves and doing something. Let me say one last word. I'm going to keep quiet. You know, you can't get me talking now. Occasionally, I still preach. Very, very, very occasionally. But I was asked to preach sometime, and I said, this guy, listen. He said, no, listen, we want you. And I took that text in Scripture of Abram and Sarah, and I took as my theme, going out into the unknown, not knowing where they were going. Go and read your Bible. Abram and Sarah go out into the unknown. And you know what that meant in their minds? I'm leaving that area where God is looking after me and God is in control. I'm going to move into the territory of another God, another people, another culture. Went out into the unknown, not knowing where they are going. That, I think, is the essence of faith, and it's the essence of politics. And Mr. Mandela led us, and then the old man went and died on us.
Any last words? We have been richly, richly blessed these last 2 days. Please join me in thanking our panel.